All right, so our guest speaker for this evening is Dana Nuccitelli. He's an environmental scientist with degrees in astrophysics and physics from the University of California, Berkeley, and UC Davis. He's also a climate journalist for skepticalscience.com, of course, but I just call it Skeptical Science. He writes for The Guardian and Yale Climate Connections. You guys have probably seen his work, or hopefully, if not, on the Nerd Corner and CCL Community. He's also the National Center for Science Education 2016 Friend of the Planet Award winner. Wow, how can you be a friend of the planet? That's awesome. That's a great award to have. Author of 10 peer-reviewed climate science papers and author of the book Climatology versus Pseudoscience. That is our wonderful Dana Nuccitelli, our CCL's research director or coordinator. And then we have 3 learning goals for this evening. So if we've done a good job here, I mean, as Dana does a good job, you're going to come away from this training with a solid understanding of a few key things. That being what climate policies made it into the Inflation Reduction Act, what the political landscape looks like for the IRA in 2025, and finally, which provisions are most crucial for protecting the climate. So let's dive in and make sure you're well equipped with all the insights you need. And all that said, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dana.
We're going to start with a quick review of what is in the Inflation Reduction Act, what it accomplished, why it's important. So, really quickly, just a reminder that before the IRA was passed, we were on track for this kind of red envelope of emissions right here, where we were going to be roughly halfway short of our Paris climate commitments. And then after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, we were in this green envelope where basically we closed about half that gap between where we were headed and where we're trying to get to by 2030. And so it was really important, of course, the largest climate policy we've ever passed. And now we want to preserve as much of that green as possible because we're trying to at least get close to our Paris commitments by 2030. So, what was in the Inflation Reduction Act to accomplish those emissions cuts? You can see on the right here a pie chart I put together. It's based on 3 modeling efforts by Princeton and Rhodium, and also some modelers that Senator Chuck Schumer's office used to estimate the emissions reductions from the different categories of policies in the IRA. We'll go into details of each of those individually a little bit later. But those are, generally speaking, clean electricity tax credits, electrical vehicle incentives, methane pollution fee, building electrification and efficiency incentives, natural climate solutions, carbon capture and storage funding, and there's a bunch more stuff in addition to that. If you want even more details, we have a training page up on CCL Community. Maybe Ricky can put a link to that in the chat. I've got a link in the speaker's notes here if you want to pop that into the chat, Ricky. And then that lists even more of the stuff that's in the IRA, like there's a green bank, there's funding from the Department of Energy for loans, all kinds of good stuff in there, hydrogen tax credits, lots of stuff. We're going to focus on these categories because these are the broad, big ones responsible for the bill's emissions cuts. But before we get into those details, let's quickly talk about the political climate that the IRA finds itself in this year. So, of course, we had our election in November. We've got Republicans holding very slim majorities in both the House and the Senate of about 3 seats or so. So what that means is that every Republican member of Congress has a lot of power because if 4 of them approximately decide to vote against something and all the Democrats also vote against something, then that can tank that particular piece of legislation. So lots of power by every Republican member of Congress. They also face a lot of pressure to kind of toe the party line because 4 of them can tank a particular bill. And so, you know, for example, if they're holding out on something, they can be threatened with a challenge in their next election, for example. So it's a very politically charged election, or a politically charged Congress cycle. This happened before. In 2017. We had a President Trump Republican House and a slim Republican majority in the Senate, and their signature bill at that time was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which had a bunch of tax cuts for individuals and corporations, Many of the the individual tax cuts are set to expire this year, and so that's a big focus of Republicans in the coming Congress is to extend those tax cuts. To do that is going to cost, if they were to extend the whole thing, something around $4 trillion over the next decade. And many Republican members of Congress don't want to add $4 trillion to the already very, very large national debts. And so they're looking for ways to pay for some of that cost to extend those tax cuts. And that is why the Inflation Reduction Act is kind of in the crosshairs, because they're looking for ways to pay for that. Repealing parts of the Inflation Reduction Act would pay for some of those tax cut extensions that they want to do. So that's kind of the political environment, the motivation for looking to repeal at least some of the Inflation Reduction Act. On the other hand, IRA-funded projects have created a lot of revenue and a lot of manufacturing jobs in a lot of different parts of the country. And so there's also motivation to keep those. And so as a result, many Republican members of Congress want to preserve at least some of the provisions in the IRA. However, the bill is in the crosshairs on the chopping block, whatever analogy you want to use. You can see this is a document that House Republicans just put out a couple of days ago, looking at how they're going to save enough money to pay for the tax cut extensions that they want to do. In there, they included some stuff to reverse climate policies. The language in here is a little obscure, but for example, they talk about repealing the EV mandate, which probably refers to the EV tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, repealing IRA green energy grants, which is not totally clear, but might refer to like the Green Bank and maybe the Department of Energy loan money. And then much clearer is the green energy tax credits that they talk about to save some hundreds of billions of dollars. That one's interesting because they note specifically, depending on political viability, because those tax credits have done a lot of good things in terms of generating revenue and manufacturing at home and jobs. And so that's kind of where we come in, is to push on that political viability and make sure they know that their constituents don't view it as a politically viable thing to get rid of these really important and positive and useful tax credits. Also along those lines, there was this really good survey of about 900 executives of clean technology companies, asking them what would be the biggest impact to their business over the next year if the IRA were to be repealed. And so you can kind of see a lot of their answers. They said we would lose revenue, we would lose projects and contracts, we would lay off employees, we would not be able to hire new employees, freeze wages for current employees. We might have to exit the clean energy space or leave the country altogether, or our doors might shut. We might have to close the business altogether. So you can see a lot of responses directly from these company executives saying that repeal of these Inflation Reduction Act provisions, tax credits, whatnot, would really harm local economies and jobs and revenue and things like that, because it would hurt these businesses that have been working to create those jobs and revenue in our districts around the country. This has been well reported, but the bulk of those new facilities, investments, and jobs are in Republican districts. About 2/3 of projects and over 3/4 of total investment dollars and jobs in Republican districts. That's largely for two reasons. One being that Republican-led states generally they have also local favorable tax statuses, so they try to encourage businesses to come in. And also, if you're going to build a big, for example, solar farm or a wind farm or just a big manufacturing facility to manufacture stuff, you need a lot of land that's available and affordable, and that tends to be in places that are relatively rural, and relatively rural places tend to vote for Republicans. And so that's just kind of why most of these projects have gone into Republican represented districts. And so there's already been a number of Republicans in Congress talking about, let's not destroy this bill altogether. 18 of them last August wrote a letter to Speaker Mike Johnson saying that prematurely repealing the energy tax credits, especially those that were used to justify investments that already broke ground, would undermine private investments and stop development that's already ongoing. A full repeal would create a worst case scenario where we would have spent billions of taxpayer dollars and received nothing in return. So they're saying, let's be cautious and smart about our efforts to repeal parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. Speaker Johnson got that message. Not too long after that, he said about the IRA, you've got to use a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. There's some provisions that have helped overall. So it's pretty clear they're not just going to repeal the whole bill at this point. They're going to look at specific provisions that they think are not the best, that they don't like that much, and those they'll repeal, but they'll keep other provisions in place. They're going to take that scalpel approach. And so now our job is to help them guide that scalpel so they're not cutting out some of the more important provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that we want to keep in place, especially. And so that's kind of our next question that we're going to address. Which provisions in the IRA are the most important for the climate? So now we're going to come back to our pie chart from those 3 modeling efforts, which just takes the average of those 3 modeling efforts in terms of estimating how much the different provisions in the IRA will reduce emissions. And so the big one responsible for just about half of the IRA's emissions cuts are the clean electricity tax credits. So that's the most important category of provisions that we want to protect in the IRA. And then there's 2 different categories of clean electricity tax credits. There's those that apply to power generation, so like solar farms and wind farms and battery facilities, for example. So there is an investment tax credit if you're going to invest in building a solar farm, for example. Or there's also a production tax credit if you have built a new solar farm and it's now producing clean electricity, then you get a tax credit for that clean electricity that it's producing. So you can kind of do one or the other of those. Or the other category of clean electricity tax credit is in manufacturing, and there's 2 of those. There is a manufacturing production tax credit. If you are basically, you've got a facility that is building, manufacturing domestic components for wind and solar energy, or inverters, or battery components, or critical minerals. So you get a tax credit for basically manufacturing those kinds of things that are going to go into building those clean electricity generation facilities. Or alternatively, there's an investment tax credit if you want to build a manufacturing facility to manufacture that stuff. Then you can get a tax credit for that, which is doing things like if you're going to produce or recycle clean energy equipment and vehicles, if you're going to process or refine or recycle critical materials. So there's lots of stuff about recycling of critical minerals and things like that. Or if you're just going to install equipment to reduce your facility's emissions by at least 20%, then you can apply for this investment tax credit. And again, it's one or the other, but those are the incentives to manufacture clean energy stuff in the United States. And so there's been a couple of good studies of what those clean electricity tax credits would achieve. And so there was one that estimated essentially that if we have the tax credits for clean electricity in place, then compared to a scenario where they are revoked, we would have twice as much new clean electricity generation capacity built between now and 2035. Similarly, there was another paper that just estimated that by 2040, if we repeal the clean electricity tax credits, then because we will be building less solar and wind and batteries and clean electricity, then there will be $336 billion less investment in those categories. We will also get 237 gigawatts, so a bunch less clean energy because we're not building as much, because there's not that tax credit in place. Importantly, if we don't build all that clean energy and we don't have those tax credits in place, that will result in about 10% higher electricity rates in 2040 and a $142 per year increase in household electricity bills by 2040. You can see that on this map, how much electricity bills would increase in each state that they looked at. These gray areas they couldn't look at because they're in kind of different categories, are not in independent system operator grid areas. And so they could only look at the ones that were, which is the ones that are colored. And so In particular, you can see Texas would see a 22% increase in electricity rates by 2040 if the clean electricity tax credits are revoked compared to where it would be if they stay in place. So in particular, if you're in Texas lobbying your member of Congress to keep these tax credits, this is a very good point to make because that's a pretty significant increase in your electricity bills. Looking at you, Ricky, for example. And the clean energy tax credits also have generated some good jobs and revenue and facilities. And so you can see these on this map, which the yellow circles are solar facilities, the orange ones are grid electrification, the blue are battery energy storage, and so on and so forth. So lots of new solar facilities, for example, solar generation facilities have been built or announced as a result of these clean electricity tax credit. This map is from e2.org, which is where we got a lot of our data that we're presenting tonight. And you can also look at who represents those particular districts. And so here, red indicates it's represented by a Republican member of Congress. Blue is a Democratic member of Congress. Also, the size of the circle is the size of the investment in that particular project. So big circles are big investments. So you can see there's a lot of Republican represented districts that have benefited from these clean energy projects, new solar farms and wind farms and battery storage facilities and things like that. So let's shift over to the next category that we're going to talk about, which is the electric vehicle tax credits. In this red triangle here, it's about 16% of the IRA's emissions cuts. So probably the second biggest category, although there's a lot of uncertainty in these, but that's our best estimate. And so to purchase EVs, there's three categories of tax credits. There's one for new EVs, and that one is particularly important because it attached requirements that the EVs and the batteries and their minerals come from the United States or at least free trade partners. So that's been really important in incentivizing some of the manufacturing in the United States. There's also tax credit for used EVs that doesn't have those same Made in America requirements. And there's a tax credit for commercial EVs that doesn't have those requirements either. And also the commercial EV tax credit created what we call the leasing loophole, where like a dealership can buy a commercial EV and then lease it out to individuals. And so they pass along that tax credit that they save as a really good leasing price. And so people have been getting really good lease deals on EVs. And so leasing EVs have been a pretty hot market. Although I think this leasing loophole is probably in the crosshairs as Congress in this session looks to make changes to the IRA. But currently you can get really good deals on EV leases. And then similar to the clean electricity tax credit, there's also manufacturing tax credits, the same to apply to EVs. So there's an investment tax credit if you're investing in a facility to make batteries or potentially EVs. And there's a manufacturing production tax credit if you have a facility that is manufacturing batteries or EV parts, then you can potentially qualify for the production tax credit. You have to do one or the other. You can't do both. But those are kind of the tax credits that incentivize battery and EV manufacturing in the United States. And so I've seen an argument made that maybe we could preserve those domestic manufacturing jobs if we keep these manufacturing tax credits while still getting rid of the EV tax credits, which like it sounds good, but the problem is if you get rid of the EV tax credits, then for one thing, there's less of a demand, less people buying EVs because now they cost more. And so there's, fewer people buying the products that these new manufacturing facilities are making. And also I talked about the new EV tax credit has those strings attached that the batteries and components have to be like made mostly in the United States. If you get rid of that requirement, get rid of that tax credit, then suddenly you don't have to make them in the United States anymore. There's no motivation because there's no tax credit. And so why then are you still going to be devoting all these resources to making EVs and batteries in the United States when you can make them in like China or Mexico or some place where you can make them more cheaply? So if you do this approach and get rid of the EV tax credit while keeping the manufacturing tax credit, it kind of still undermines the domestic manufacturing because you're undermining the motivation to build in the United States, and you're also undermining the market of people buying EVs in the United States. So it's a tricky thing. people might make the argument for doing this, but I think it probably would not work out very well. It would still really hurt those new American like battery and EV manufacturing facilities because the market would kind of drop out from under their feet. And so they still might have to reduce production, lay off workers, potentially shut their doors and do other things. Also, of all of the projects that have been built, announced, funded with IRA money, the vast majority has gone to EV and battery manufacturing, which you can see on this table. Like the vast majority of projects, about 60% of the total projects have gone to making EVs and batteries. And then it's even a bigger chunk of the investments. It's $126 billion in not just those that have been built, but those have also been announced, because this is data from e2.org, which looks at announcements. But of those that have been built and announced, almost 80% of the total investment dollars have gone to EVs and batteries, which are mostly batteries for EVs, some battery storage for power plants, but mostly batteries for EVs. You can see also lots and lots of jobs, getting close to 100,000 jobs. So again, if you get rid of the EV tax credits, you kind of tank that market, and then there's a lot of investment dollars and jobs in manufacturing facilities that are going to have a hard time, keeping everybody employed and keeping their doors open. This is from the Clean Investment Monitor, which is showing actual those have been built so far. So you can see the investments are mostly the blue, which is in batteries. The vast majority of the investment dollars that have been already built, gone to facilities that have been built have been for batteries, also a big chunk for EVs, and then solar is kind of a big chunk too. But, that just goes to show, again, the importance of those EV tax credits and that kind of that requirement that they be built mostly in the United States and sourced from the United States. Everybody then started to build all this infrastructure, the supply chain to build EVs and batteries in the United States. And that's the reason they did it, was because of that EV tax credit and those requirements. And so if you get rid of that, that kind of undermines this investment. There are, however, valid arguments against the EV tax credit that I'm going to talk about here. So for example, there was just a study published that we talked about in the Nerd Corner, posted over there by Jonathan Marshall, that estimated the EV tax credits will only increase EV sales by about 20% through 2035. You can see that here in this table with the 81%, which is basically saying that 81% of the EVs purchased between now and 2035 with EV tax credit in place would have been purchased anyway if the EV tax credit weren't there. That's because the EV tax credits, because EVs and new cars in general are pretty expensive. They're mostly bought by relatively wealthy Americans who would have in any case bought an EV because they can afford it, or maybe they would have just bought a different kind of fuel efficient vehicle. And so there's also an argument against giving these effectively subsidies to relatively wealthy Americans. You can say that's just not something we generally want to do. So that's another argument against EV tax credits. You can also argue it's not a very economically efficient way to spend our money. They estimated, you can see here, the best estimate was that the EV tax credits would cost $310 per ton of carbon dioxide reduced. A general benchmark of our kind of reasonably cost-effective climate policy is around $100 per ton. You can see also that's about what the clean electricity tax credits cost, is $96 per ton was their best estimate. And so basically the EV tax credits are about 3 times less economically efficient than the clean electricity tax credits. So that's kind of the arguments against it. However, the EV tax credits still do reduce emissions. They still do boost EV sales by about 20% or so between now and 2035, which is nothing to sneeze at. We would like to get those extra 20% of EVs on the road. So it's not like super cost effective, but it nevertheless is an important way, as we saw in that pie chart with that slice of the pie, it's an important way to reduce our overall climate pollution. And also, like, if we were to take this money away, it's not like it would go to a more efficient way to reduce emissions. It would go to paying for some tax cuts that have nothing to do with the climate. So we definitely want to keep these EV tax credits in place. It's just these are kind of some of the arguments that people could make to say we don't want to keep the EV tax credits. And going back to the general manufacturing and jobs picture, this again from e2.org is a map of different kinds of new manufacturing facilities that have been built or announced since the IRA was passed. You can see lots and lots of light blue and dark blue circles, especially kind of in the Midwest and South. Light blue is clean vehicles, which is almost all EVs. Dark blue is batteries and energy storage, which is almost all EV batteries. And so you can see this is like all investment in new manufacturing of EVs and batteries, again, in that part of the country especially. And again, here you can see it is predominantly in Republican represented districts. So it's just useful data to keep in mind for your lobbying efforts. So let's talk about a few of the other provisions. Of course, we got the methane pollution fee responsible for about 7% of the IRA's overall emissions cuts. It was our first federal price on a climate pollutant. So we, of course, want to get a price on carbon pollution, but at least we have this price on methane pollution. It's not an economy-wide price. It applies to specifically the oil and gas industry and the methane leakage from their activities that are not in compliance with EPA regulations. So like if the EPA says you have to meet a certain level of methane leakage and they don't meet it, then they have to pay that methane price on that extra leakage. That's a little bit tricky because now we're going to have the Trump administration coming in with a new EPA administrator, and they'll probably try to mess with those EPA methane regulations and change them somehow. However, there is still the Inflation Reduction Act language saying that methane leakage has to have a price on it, as long as this language stays in effect. So of course, that's what we want to do, is lobby to keep that in effect. One interesting point is that the sort of crosshairs on the methane fee has a different motivation than getting rid of the tax cuts, because the methane pollution fee actually generates a little bit of revenue because you're putting a price on the methane that the oil and gas companies pay and send that money to the Treasury. And so it actually generates a little bit of money for the federal budget. It's not very much money. It's $7 billion or so over 10 years, whereas again, we're looking at $4 trillion that they're trying to pay for. So it's not a very persuasive argument that this generates revenue, and so you shouldn't get rid of it because it's a very small bit of revenue. However, the motivation for getting rid of the methane fee is different than the motivation for getting rid of the tax credits, which is to pay for other tax cuts. Also, big oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil support methane policies like the methane fee because they operate on this global oil and gas market. And pretty much every country is trying to reduce their emissions, and like they might still need natural gas, but they would prefer to use natural gas that's relatively low emissions. And so that's why companies like ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron, the big guys who work on the global market, they're already taking efforts to reduce their leakage so they can say like, this natural gas that we're selling you is relatively low emissions. So they have a better market for it. That's what the demand is for. So they're already taking steps to reduce their methane leakage, and so they don't have any big problem with methane policies like the methane fee. However, small oil and gas companies, there are lots and lots of those in the United States. They don't care so much about the international markets. They just don't want to take the effort and expense to plug their leaks and fix their leaks. And so they're the ones who advocate against the methane fee. And then they have like industry trade representatives like the American Petroleum Institute that lobby on their behalf, that are lobbying very hard against the methane fee. And so that's kind of the reason and the key stakeholders that are arguing, lobbying against the methane fee. It's those small oil and gas companies and their trade representatives, because they don't want to pay for that cost of fixing leaks or to pay for that extra leakage that they're causing. Then we have building electrification and efficiency, somewhere around 5% of the IRA's emissions cuts. We got tax credits and rebates to make homes and other buildings more energy efficient. That constitutes heat pumps, rooftop solar panels and battery systems, weatherization, doing more insulation and closing leaks, home energy audits, all that good stuff. We've got lots of education resources on this stuff. I've done a bunch of trainings about it. We got the Electrification Action Team that has good information about it. So you can learn all about that elsewhere in CCL. Some good news is that a lot of the rebate funding at least, has already been obligated, and so it's going to be relatively safe from being pulled back. But any tax credits for things like solar and heat pumps and stuff like that are vulnerable to being in the crosshairs to pay for those other tax cuts. We actually got some good news on that topic on the rebates today. This is an updated map from the Department of Energy. So the way the home electrification and efficiency rebates work is that the Department of Energy has the money. They send it to each individual state, which has its own program to disperse those funds via various programs that sometimes it's like an existing program, or sometimes they create a new program to distribute that money for home electrification and efficiency. And so this is a map of the status where the green indicates states where the rebates are already, at least some of the rebates are available. The yellow is the states where the funds have been awarded from the Department of Energy to the states. And this is like a radical change from what it was, I think, just yesterday. I think this was just announced. Like I looked at it 2 weeks ago, and like most of these states were like blue and gray, where they had been either preparing or just submitted their application, but hadn't yet been approved by the Department of Energy. And then all of a sudden they did this big swath of like almost everybody has suddenly been approved and awarded funds. And once the funds are awarded, then they're kind of like contractually obligated, and it's very hard to pull them back to pay for other things. And so this funding is relatively safe. We'll see exactly how safe, but relatively safe. Also, you can see like almost every state wants this funding because it's money from the federal government to give to their residents to make their homes better. So like there's interests in every individual state to keep these programs in place. They've already put the effort into their state energy offices making these programs to distribute this money. So there's definitely a lot of motivation, a lot of people who want to keep these programs in place in each individual state. And so hopefully these funds will be relatively safe, but we'll see what happens in the next coming months. And then we got climate smart agriculture, something in the ballpark of 9% of the bill's emissions cuts. This is $20 billion that will be spent over 5 years for climate smart agriculture through the Department of Agriculture's conservation programs that are already in place. So these are programs that basically farmers apply for grants to get money from the USDA. They're very popular, very oversubscribed, which means farmers each year apply for a lot more grants than are actually available. So farmers love these things because basically they send in an application and then they get grant money, and they can do things like cover cropping and low-till agriculture and planting more trees on their farms or their pasture land. Things that some of those things, the climate smart ones, are good for the climate because they can reduce carbon. And so we want to keep both the funding in place and the climate smart agriculture requirement in place. I've seen some Republicans say like we should just take this money and use it to pay for some of the tax cuts. Some other House Republicans said, no, we should keep this money in place and make the farmers happy and get this money to the farmers, but we should just remove the climate requirements. This language in the IRA that says those projects will reduce, capture, avoid, or sequester carbon dioxide. Just get rid of that language and just put the money into the general conservation programs. So we at CCL, of course, want to keep that language. There's like no reason why the money shouldn't be used for a project that will specifically reduce and sequester and capture carbon. So let's just keep that language in place. And so that's going to be kind of our lobbying position is, yeah, everybody likes to also help farmers. Farmers are, they're important. They grow our food, and they're also a very influential lobbying group. And so they have both Democrats and Republicans that support giving farmers money. And so let's support the farmers and also help them do these climate smart practices. And then finally, there's this 8% or so of emissions from the EPA, from the Inflation Reduction Act, from industrial carbon capture, which is for either capturing carbon from a smokestack, that's carbon capture and then storing it somewhere, or removing it from the atmosphere, which is direct air capture and then storing it somewhere. So these practices are not yet widely implemented because they're kind of difficult to do, they're kind of expensive, and so they're not very common yet, but that's the idea, is that this tax credit will then make it more financially viable to do these things. And so then we'll have more projects to do them, and then we'll learn how to do them better, and then costs will come down, and maybe they'll become more viable over time. These also already have bipartisan appeal because basically you're giving some tax credits and some funds to oil and gas industry and different industries that are putting carbon into the atmosphere. And so it's kind of helping these groups that already tend to be very influential and powerful lobbyists and have friends in Congress. And so I think the carbon capture tax credits are probably pretty safe, but again, we'll see what happens in the coming months. So that's kind of a breakdown of the individual tax credits and provisions in the bill and how effective they are. And then, as Ricky alluded to, we also have this really cool database that the research team just put together. You can find it at cclusa.org/defend-IRA-data. It's also linked at the top of our new Defend the IRA Data training page. And so, for example, if you go to this database, and let's say you're in Louisiana's 4th District and your representative is Mike Johnson, and so then you look and you say, okay, in this district, we've got one project.
Hey, Dana,
Yes.
I don't think we're seeing your screen. You might want to try to
Not
reshare.
seeing my screen. Okay, let me try again. Let's say stop share and try again. How about now?
Is anybody else seeing it? Is it just me? Everybody else is seeing it. Never mind. Sorry.
All right, you were messing with me, Ricky. So this project in Mike Johnson's district has $28.5 million in estimated investments, 153 estimated jobs. It is a Prolec GE transformer manufacturing facility for renewable energy applications. And so the relevant tax credits in the IRA are the clean electricity tax credits because those transformers are going to solar farms and wind farms, things like that. And there's also an advanced energy a manufacturing tax credit that is relevant to this particular project. And so you can then use that information in your lobbying efforts and, for example, inform the folks in your district. And you can also and inform Mike Johnson when you lobby with him and say, hey, there's this great project using this IRA tax credit. I think we should keep these tax credits in place. Maybe you'll do some grasstop efforts and go to Prolec GE and try to get them to write a letter to Mike Johnson or join you in your lobbying or something like that. So there's a lot of opportunities to use this data to improve our lobbying efforts. Overall, there are projects in 170 congressional districts, almost 40% of all districts, including 101 Republican districts, which is almost half of Republican districts, and also in 40 states. So there's a pretty good chance, decent chance there's a project in your district, but if not, there's a 80% chance that there are some projects in your state. Some folks in New Jersey emailed me and they're like, why don't you have any projects in New Jersey in your database? And I was like, well, I guess there's just no projects in New Jersey yet. So you're in the unfortunate 10 states that don't have any projects announced or built yet, but there are 40 states that do have projects. And so I encourage folks to check this out, use this data, familiarize yourself with the projects that have been either built or announced in your district, in your state, and try to use that wisely in your lobbying efforts.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.